if you set up the US dollar as the world reserve currency and you set up the US Treasury as the world reserve asset, then it is only a matter of time, based on the math, before you basically run into Triffin's dilemma, which says that you're going to impoverish your middle classes. And by definition, you're going to end up in debt. Because by definition, if you are the reserve currency and the reserve asset, you have to end up in debt to do it. You're the bank for the world. It is basically a form of long-term suicide. It gives rise to populism. It creates massive wealth inequality inside the country, and ultimately you're hanging yourself with a golden rope. One of the things that John Maynard Keynes told the US in 1947 at Bretton Woods is he said, look, if you set up the US dollar as the world reserve currency and you set up the US Treasury as the world reserve asset, then it is only a matter of time, based on the math, the actual mathematical requirement, it is only a matter of time before you basically run into Triffin's dilemma, which says that you're going to impoverish your middle classes. And the reason you're going to impoverish your middle classes is that you're going to have to supply capital to the world, because you're going to be trading with the world, and you're going to have to provide them enough liquidity that as they save money, as those export surplus nations save money, they're going to be buying your financial assets. Your dollar is going to be overvalued, and it's going to create a wealth effect that ends up impoverishing your middle class. It's going to overvalue your own currency, which means it's going to harm your productive classes. It's going to harm your manufacturing sector. And by definition, you're going to end up in debt. Because by definition, if you are the reserve currency and the reserve asset, you have to end up in debt to do it. You're the bank for the world. He said this. This was not an unknown thing back then. Keynes was a genius. But anyway, he said it. And the U.S. response, this was in New Hampshire, the U.S. response said, fine, no problem, we'll take the hit points. And the reason they did, ultimately, is they wanted the power that came with it. Because you get immense power with it for a while. The immense power you get with it is you get to establish the platform. You establish the trading platform, the financial platform, and all the political power that comes with owning that political platform and that financial platform for the next 5 or 6 decades. So every transaction, or 70% of the transactions that occurred for the next 50 years, occurred in the US dollar. The banking system had to run through U.S. banks, or the Eurodollar market, which is dollar transactions in foreign banks. The Federal Reserve of the U.S. becomes the most important financial institution on earth. Washington, D.C. becomes the most important financial center in the world, other than New York. And of course, there becomes a political collaboration between New York and Washington, D.C. to do it. Now, it is basically a form of long-term suicide if a country doesn't recognize that that is a problem. Some people call it the exorbitant burden, because it's like an exorbitant privilege for the first 5 or 6 decades. Then it becomes an exorbitant burden for exactly the reasons we're seeing. It gives rise to populism. It creates massive wealth inequality inside the country, and ultimately you're hanging yourself with a golden rope. So if we look at that contradiction and we say, okay, China's not going to be dumb enough to make that mistake, and they're not. They know that this is a problem. They've controlled their own capital account. They've been very careful about that, so they can control the value of their currency and keep it low in order to continue to basically be the producer to the entire world of all things, which is its own kind of problem, actually, politically, for them. Then what? Let me go back to 1947. Keynes proposed a solution. He called it the bankor. The bankor was a neutral settlement reserve asset, which basically said, hey, it's going to be this, think about it almost like a proto-Bitcoin. It's like, we're going to do this thing where everybody can trade in and out of the bankor. And then depending on your own trade volumes and the value of currency and a bunch of other stuff, like your own stuff can fluctuate, but the bankor will be a neutral thing so that you don't impoverish your own country. It'll give you more freedom as a country. The trade-off is you won't get to control it quite as much. So now that we have digital currency, now that we have Bitcoin and we have these other sort of trustless networks from a technological point of view, it is, I mean, to me, it's almost inconceivable that in 30 years, we are not on some form of a digital bankor, basically a crypto Rails-based neutral settlement reserve asset that, yes, is sponsored by the next hegemon. If it's China, fine. It's kind of sanctified by them, but is not actually, does not impoverish them over time, because it is not their reserve assets that have to come out of their country in order to finance it or in order to provide liquidity to the whole world. The liquidity function can occur on this reserve, this independent neutral settlement reserve platform. Now, prior to 1931, what played that role was gold. Just to kind of set your understanding, like what played that role was gold. And so currencies would fluctuate relative to the value of gold. The problem gold ran into, as Nixon discovered, is that the growth of gold the growth of the rate of growth of gold coming out of the ground did not keep up with the growth of the global economy. And so people were finding that their currencies were depreciating relative to gold because that's just forced by the math. And so by going to a free floating exchange rate, then it solved that problem. But it really didn't it solved the problem for others in certain ways, and it certainly didn't solve the problem for the US. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that I would expect a transnational, post-statal, so non-statal, digital neutral settlement reserve asset of some form to arise. Some people from the West are going to say, oh, it's very clearly Bitcoin. And I'm going to say, not if China's the hegemon. My guess is that they probably wouldn't sponsor that as the protocol. My guess is that they would sponsor a new one that's not controlled by, like, 400 Westerners, because the power law associated with Bitcoin's ownership has radically imbalanced that relative to its early start to a small group of whales. And so I would expect that if they sponsor a new protocol that's going to play this role and they're the hegemon, they're probably going to bring it out of the ground themselves as a greenfield effort.